Hi, I'm Alex Garcia, and thanks for joining us here at NTWC Live. It is a team effort between Bill Reed, Tim Smith, and I. We'd like to say thank you to a few groups that helped make this possible. It's USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, the Weather Company, and the Weather Boy. And now, here's Tim Smith.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Live for June the 15th. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. Good to see everybody along with us today on this 15th day of June, 2 weeks into the Atlantic hurricane season, a month into the Pacific hurricane season, and got some shenanigans going on out there in both basins today. Bill's going to talk about that in just a second. Our program today, Mike Bilder, really looking forward to this. Everybody on the program today has some connection to what Mike's going to talk about today, so we're kind of anxious to hear everything we're going to hear about Hurricane Agnes and the 50th anniversary of a storm that impacted a lot of folks 50 years ago. A serious impact on a big piece of the nation. I want to thank our sponsors who make this event a possibility. Of course, USAA, the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the two sponsors that make our live event on South Padre Island a possibility and make all of these programs a possibility as well. Thank you so much for what you guys do. The Weather Company, the Port of Brownsville, Visit Brownsville, Black Magic Design, and Walmart, all folks that make NTWC Live a reality. So thanks to all of them. Without you, we couldn't be here. Again, a big program coming up today. We've got Hal Needham with us as well, who's going to be joining in the conversation. And of course, our host with the most, our moderator for today, the former director of the National Hurricane Center. Please welcome and say good morning to Mr. Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Tim. It's a nice, beautiful day. Light, smoky, gray-brown sky with Saharan dust. Actually saw some rain on the Brownsville radar. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was reaching the ground, but it was interesting.
It rained a brown rain early this morning.
Yeah, and summer is here. Well, let's talk real quick about the tropics before we get into our subject of the day. Just a quick overview on the satellite. The Gulf is, other than a little cluster of thunderstorms that formed probably with the land breeze effect down here off of Mexico, and then the stream of showers that I was chatting with Tim about coming up into Texas. Otherwise, not much convection at all. Northwest Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, pretty quiet across the Atlantic. We're looking at this thing here. We'll talk about it a little bit. There's another area that is suspect south of El Salvador and Guatemala. And then our storm out here, I don't know yet if they've raised it to hurricane, but it's on its way to that. The Atlantic, again, it's a tricky little forecast. It's hugging the coastline of Central America for the most part, so the probabilities are quite low right now on development. But if it were to form a center a little farther offshore, there is some risk that we could get a tropical cyclone that'll affect the Yucatan and parts of the east coast of Gulf Coast of Mexico later on. Take that. There we go. I'll turn our attention a little bit to Blas, whatever you want to pronounce it. Convection has been firing and very cold top convection at that. Very symmetrical pattern. Outflow and is looking quite good on the western side, not too shabby elsewhere. So the thinking is that it will become a hurricane if it hasn't already. I'll kick this into update mode, and sure enough, they upgraded it to a 75-mile-an-hour hurricane at the just now issued 10 a.m. advisory. Typical of most storms that form in this area in the Eastern Pacific, its track is parallel to the coastline of Mexico as a hurricane through Friday evening, and then it'll encounter wind shear, dry air, and somewhat cooler waters. The perfect trifecta for reducing the strength of a tropical cyclone, which happens frequently with these out there. The other area, forgot to talk about that a little bit real quick here. Right now, not much organized in the area that they're finding a little low-level circulation in here, but they give it a window in there to develop in the next several days before it too encounters a wind shear problem. This, in their case, out of the east. If you like a little quick thing on the models, this was the 06 run. There's Blas. This is 850 vorticity, 500 millibar heights, 200 millibar winds, kind of gives you a snapshot of the low, middle, and high level conditions that will affect the storm. And initially it starts out with the vorticity center of the hurricane, and then the developing systems on either side of Central America. And the GFS is following, and the ECMWF follow about the same path with BLAS, so it's not a forecast challenge as it is our eastern system. The GFS takes it off further to the north before bending back to the west, whereas in the ECMWF, most of its ensemble members keep it over land without developing it. There are even some hint that we're getting a little Fujiwara going with the system on the other side of the Central America. But this big ridge building up over us that'll keep the heat in place and drive an easterly current is going to send this thing pretty much straight west, no matter where it actually comes up into the Yucatan or not, and off into the coast of Mexico. And if we follow the system down across that's behind BLAS, the GFS holds onto it without doing much with it, and then way out in time, it develops it into a hurricane. And normally I would blow them off as a model cane, but it is starting with a pre-existing source of vorticity and moisture. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on as it may actually come to fruition. And it too keeps it offshore. And for the truly demented, we have our daily look at model cane. I got the wrong run in there. Otherwise, they're the same. We'll get back here. All right. And there's our storm forming, and it's shown several model runs now, that same solution. But then our typical 10-day out, we start to develop a low down here in the Northwest Caribbean in the model, even though there's nothing there that it's starting with. And it Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, it's going to blow my house away if this is true. One of the things I like about this site is it's very quick to do a comparison of previous model runs, and here was just 6 hour early model run valid at the same time. There's nothing there. So I pretty much concluded our model cane when I see that kind of inconsistency from time to time. Satellite imagery on our Atlantic area, again, it does look like the circulation, whether it's at the surface or not, is debatable, but at least in the mid-levels, is up over Nicaragua right now on land, and there's plenty of convection out there, but it's not very well organized, so the low probabilities probably make sense at this time. And just a quick shot of you can see here on these two maps on the bottom there, the forecast guidance is keeps it well south and doesn't really develop it much. And there's the European source, which keeps moving it across Central America. One last thing on the tropics. This is we're not yet in a Cape Verde season, but in the area between the Sahel and the equatorial Africa, there's quite a number of disturbances rolling across the continent at this time. And we, of course, will be monitoring those. Right now, none of the models get excited about any of them that are coming off. The conditions are somewhat hostile. All right, now at this point, Alex, we want to have a sponsor break.
Beach lovers know it. Fishermen and water lovers know it. Little kids and big kids know it. Sandcastle builders, free spirits, and adventure seekers know it. Everyone who's ever been here knows it. South Padre Island is so fun, so perfect, and most of all, so Padre. Plan your escape at sopadre.com.
We made USAA Insurance for members like Kate, a former Army medic made of the flexibility to handle whatever Monday has in store and tackle 4 things at once. So when her car got hit, she didn't worry. She simply filed a claim on her USAA app and said,
"I've got this."
USAA Insurance is made the way Kate needs it. Easy. She can even pick her payment plan, so it's easy on her budget and her life. USAA. What you're made of, we're made for. USAA.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited about today's program. Being the old guy on this show here, I actually have a connection to 50 years ago in Agnes, and that I was flying in the Navy back then, and in my first hurricane training flight, when the storm was off the east coast of the U.S., I got to fly in it, and I remember some of it. I also remember that I got relatively long-term air sickness on that particular flight. It was turbulent. Our guest speaker today, Mike Bilder, is a hurricane program manager and a hurricane liaison team lead for FEMA Region 3, which covers the Mid-Atlantic out of Philadelphia. And if I were still at the Hurricane Center, he would be one of the people I'd be talking with whenever there's a threat up to the Mid-Atlantic on our daily briefings with FEMA. Mike has an interesting prior career to this. He worked for 8 years with the Weather Service as an emergency manager and policy analyst. That's a good move the Weather Service made, adding that type of expertise in their headquarters. Mike has a passion for history, and that's why we bring him on here today. He has lived his entire life in the areas hit hard by Agnes. So, Mike, welcome to our show, and it's all yours.
Hey, thanks, Bill. And it's I love the story about you flying into Agnes. You know, that just is really cool, and that's what's great about one of the things about Agnes and this whole project is hearing the stories from folks like you, as well as the folks who lived it on the ground, and it just teaches you so much. And so wanted to thank you again for bringing me on to talk about this, because I think first and foremost, and this is probably debatable, but in my professional opinion, looking at a lot of the data, looking at the scope of the disaster, it is hard to say that Agnes is the worst tropical related event in the history of at least FEMA Region 3, which is most of the Mid-Atlantic. As I'll mention here shortly, it was the costliest tropical cyclone in American history up to that point. It held it for about 11 years. So it's an event that had we still see legacies of it today, and it was particularly hard hitting in Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York and Maryland, and we're going to dive into that. But as you mentioned, I lived my entire life. I kind of like starting the story by looking at my personal history, and I've lived my entire life in ground zero of Agnes. And I'm not just talking about like I moved from one county to the neighboring county, and so it's a highly concentrated area. These places are all throughout the Mid-Atlantic. They are spread far and wide. So not listed there was Pittsburgh, because I didn't live in Pittsburgh. My parents and my siblings did live in Pittsburgh at the time. So now we're not going to talk a lot about Pittsburgh today. We might get to that reason later on, but it did still see major stage flooding, and it's still number one in at least one of the gauges nearby. Actually, let me, sorry, I need to share my screen. Sorry. Again, there's a picture of Pittsburgh there as I said, major stage flooding there. I was born in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, which is in central Pennsylvania. And real quick, this is a picture of the church I was baptized in. So, and we'll have more to say about that later in the program. For those who stick around, there's a special twist at the end of this. This is my home county. Tioga County, Pennsylvania. I grew up in Wellsboro. If we also get to talk about mitigation, I'll bring up Wellsboro again, and a very prominent current Weather Service official will make a cameo in this presentation. But my town was actually saved by the reservoirs, but the rest of the county was completely cut off and severely hit. In fact, they had to bring by helicopter supplies in. I went to college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is in south central Pennsylvania. I went to Dickinson College. And that was another area that was really hard hit by Agnes. And in fact, you see Dreyer Hall there, right there in the news article. That's my freshman dorm. My freshman dorm room was used as a shelter room for Agnes survivors. Then I lived 10 years in DC, where Agnes still reigns high on a few of the record books there. And there was major stage flooding. And now I currently live in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which was also hit hard by Agnes. This is actually one of my favorite photos from Agnes. It's very dynamic. And I think the last connection, one of the other connections I'll mention right now is that my current job, I kind of tell people it's kind of goofy, but it's like I'm an Agnes buster. Like that's my job is specifically to prepare this part of the country for the next Agnes, and work with the states, work with the locals. We got to get ready. So what we're going to do real quick is kind of go through just high level stuff, like the summary of the storm. We're not going to get too detailed into the play-by-play, but we will kind of tee it up, and then we'll go to questions or talk about some of the other impacts later on. One thing about the lead up to Agnes, it was a textbook case of, bad antecedent conditions. And so the May leading up to June 1972 was above average in precipitation for this part of the country. And then there were a number of PREs that came through the area. In fact, I was doing research on a couple of the towns newspaper, and I'm hitting these flooding photos. And I'm like, oh, these are interesting Agnes photos. And then I'm looking closer, wait, this isn't Agnes. This was a few days before Agnes. And there was that one particular PRE that you'll see on satellite that was from the 15th to 17th that really primed things and set the ball for Agnes to spike. So it was a prime example again about antecedent conditions and things. You don't want these type of conditions when something like Agnes, especially Agnes, comes through. So you were mentioning the Central American Gyre before. Actually, I was talking to Phil Plattsbach at the National Hurricane Center a couple months ago, and I was like, is Agnes the worst CAG storm on record? And his database doesn't go back to 72 yet, but he thought it was an interesting question because we just looked at this part in your briefing. We just looked at this part of the basin, and it's very typical for June systems, and it formed on 16th into a tropical storm right there off the Yucatan. Started moving northward and attained Category 1 strength on June 18th. And then, but let me just back up real quick. You see there that system that moved in prior to Agnes. So you see that front moving through, and it's still there's still some residual moisture there, or continuing to bring a healthy amount of rain to the region. And landfall on the 19th as a Cat 1 near Mexico Beach. And again, one thing to note here is just keep an eye on the size of Agnes, which was 1,000 miles wide, which plays a big role in this because, again, just like with storm surge, the bigger the wind field, the more like with storm surge and fetch, you can also pull in a lot of tropical moisture. And it degraded, or not degraded, it went down to a tropical depression as it moved over the southeast. But what also started happening is that there was another front that it was interacting with, and we had, baroclinicity for the weather nerds, and actually helped spur another secondary low that started stalking Agnes. Now, Agnes itself then moved back over the Atlantic waters and re-intensified into a tropical storm. And you can see here just the amount of moisture, the size of the storm, what's being funneled right into the mid-Atlantic. It then makes landfall again up in Long Island as a tropical storm. And you can see by here, it's just a giant mess. And then it merges with that second low and stalls over the mid-Atlantic, especially Pennsylvania, and just continues to stall. And finally on the 25th or 26th, it eventually leaves. Real quick, just to look at the track itself, there's another way of looking at it, but I don't particularly love the map on the right, but what I do like about it is it shows that secondary low that was, from the frontal interaction born and stalked and then eventually absorbed Agnes and, became Franken Agnes, just a gigantic system that you saw there. Rainfall storm totals were pretty bad, and we're going to talk about the Appalachian Mountains there, but, one thing to note, that they noted in some of that the worst rainfall happened when it re-intensified as a tropical storm, over the Atlantic waters. But one thing also is when it was even making landfall, some of that moisture was already being funneled up into the mid-Atlantic, which is something we've seen before, like with Tropical Storm Lee, with some of these mechanisms. So I recreated, it took forever, but I recreated went through all the gauges through several states, and I wanted to find, okay, let's try to recreate the AHIPS map that we see today from Agnes, and this just blew me away. Like so for those who aren't used to AHIPS, purple is major stage flooding. So we're going to dig down into the purple dots here and out to some of the meteorologists or hydrologists that might be looking. There's some things I actually put below flood stage whenever I found it, because I wanted to see how close they were to some of the major stage, and you could see like there'd be one very, very close proximity where one area wouldn't have gotten anything. And then you go to the other side of the county or whatnot, and it would be major stage flooding, which is something we see a lot. You know, rainfall is and the flooding that results is a very precise science. And it really does matter where the rain is falling, where the footprint is. One thing also that's very important about Agnes, I think the reason why it sticks around in our one of the reasons why it sticks around in memories, the places it hit. This is a densely populated part of the nation. And let's just go through the major metropolitan areas that got hit by major stage flooding. Roanoke, Lynchburg, Richmond, DC, Baltimore, Frederick, Harrisburg, York, Wilmington, Delaware, Philly, Reading, Allentown, the Jersey suburbs of New York City, Wilkes-Barre, which is pretty much the ground zeros from Agnes, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, Elmira, New York, and Corning as well, right next door, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Wheeling, Morgantown. If 1/5 of this happened, it'd be a really bad week for a really bad couple of weeks in my job. Imagine all this happening, all these population centers being hit at basically the same time, you know, within a couple of days, and just residual flooding on top of that. And some of these cities getting hit twice, first by the flash flooding and then by the big river flooding. I mean, this is amazing. I show this graphic a lot because it shows you, if you're an emergency manager at a regional level like mine, this is a nightmare beyond nightmares. This map shows where it still stands. It's one way of looking at like where it is 50 years later, where is Agnes still standing in the record books? The reds stand for where it's still number 1. The blues are number 2, and the blacks are basically 3 through 5. As you can see, I mean, Agnes still reigns very, very, Agnes's reign over this part of the country is still very strong as far as records go. And just to zoom in on region 3 specifically, you know, you kind of get a little more. I mean, you're seeing number 1 records in Richmond, in the DC area, in the Baltimore area. You know, actually Ida, it was number 1 in Norristown on the Schuylkill just before Ida, but Ida knocked it down to number 2. So there was a number 1 here in the Philly area, but tons in the Susquehanna Basin, still parts of the Allegheny Basin, the James, you name it. It is a storm that is still reigning strong. Quickly, this is a crusting record, and again, crusting is just when the worst of flooding happens. It doesn't mean this is when it's the only time when the major stage is happening. I mapped this out as well because I like to show there was a lot of chaos because certain areas were cresting, you know, certain cities were cresting at the same time as other cities way far away. And sometimes you'd have, you know, double crests again with those flash flooding and the big river flooding. And again, I look at this and I'm like, what would have been like? It just, if I were doing my job back then, and it would have been again a nightmare of a week, and everything just going on. You think of injects and stuff like that. You even have, you know, parts of Pennsylvania cresting on the 21st, and the rest of the Commonwealth is, you know, on the 23rd, and it's going all over the place. So I like showing this to emergency managers because, like, get ready for something like this. Like, this is not going to be intuitive if we have this again. So why was it so catastrophic from a meteorological, hydrological? We've talked about some of these already, the antecedent conditions, the large circulation, that frontal system. Quickly with the mountains, you know, we all know that, you know, the upflow of the air up the, you know, the wind side of the mountain, or the mountains, will help exacerbate the rainfall, enhance the rainfall. So that's part of the problem when you have that forcing, you know, going and pushing that moisture up the eastern slopes of the Appalachians, but also just the Appalachians themselves. The terrain allows then for some violent, you know, flooding behavior as well. And it's a very old part of the nation, right? So we have a lot of towns and cities that are built right into the foothills, the Piedmont, and you know, even sometimes in the mountains as well, or at least these smaller towns built into the mountains, and with all that concrete and development, you know, exacerbates the rainfall. So we've seen these, you know, row houses on the steep hills, like in Pittsburgh or parts of Philly or Wilkes-Barre, Scranton or Ellicott City, parts of DC. Like those are very common in our part of the country, and when it comes to Agnes, it's that interface between extreme rainfall and urbanization does not mix well at all. we don't have to belabor this chart too much. Just wanted to point out that 50,000 people or 50,000 houses, homes were severely damaged or completely destroyed. Bulk of those are in Pennsylvania, but New York, Virginia, Florida, Maryland, there is a coastal aspect of this. I'm freezing over the Florida story of this. There was a tornado outbreak. There was, obviously storm surge. So Florida did get hit hard too, but it largely overshadowed by what happened farther north. And as I mentioned, it was the costless disaster in American history, costless tropical cyclone in American history up to that point, and one of the costliest disasters overall. It's harder to quantify, but it was definitely not just from a hurricane perspective, from a disaster perspective in general. It really ranked high up at that time. Evacuees, for coastal evacuation, this is pretty tame, but for an inland evacuation, this is something else. 220,000 people, at least in Pennsylvania, being temporarily displaced from their homes. And again, New York and Virginia, there you see a lot of folks as well. And the last part of our summary slides here is looking at the fatalities. Very tragic stories, especially as a parent. Some of the stories I was reading were really hard to read. And a lot of it was related to the flash flooding and just some horrific stories coming out of here. I will say, as tragic of an event it was, and I say this, I don't say this lightly, I will say that for an event of this magnitude, it could have been a lot worse. And there are some things we could talk about later as to why the fatalities were able to stay at 121, which is still a horrific event. I want to make that very clear. But it's one thing to look at, a lot of the bravery, some of the work they did back then, the mitigation especially. This could have been even a higher number. But just to show you, Hurricane Camille came through Virginia 3 years prior to that and pretty much killed just as many people in a couple hours than Agnes did in a week. So hurricanes are strange beasts, right? Or these systems are, very unpredictable sometimes. So anyhow, that's the summary of the situation. And I think we can reserve the rest for later on, or as we continue the conversation.
After I unmute, that was excellent. And I've got a whole bunch of questions, but first we're going to catch another break from our sponsors. Back to you, Alex.
We made USAA Insurance for members like Kate, a former Army medic made of the flexibility to handle whatever Monday has in store and tackle 4 things at once. So when her car got hit, she didn't worry. She simply filed a claim on her USAA app and said,
"I've got this."
USAA Insurance is made the way Kate needs it. Easy. She can even pick her payment plan, so it's easy on her budget and her life. USAA. What you're made of, we're made for.
Blackmagic Design's A10 Mini line of live production switchers makes it easy to create professional broadcast quality programs and multi-camera productions and stream them live to YouTube, Facebook, and more, or present live via Zoom and Skype. Simply connect the A10 Mini and switch live up to 8 high-quality video camera inputs for dramatically better quality images. All A10 Mini models have USB that works like a webcam for use with any streaming software, while the A10 Mini Pro and the A10 Mini Extreme models add direct live streaming and recording to USB discs. A10 Mini models start at $295. For more information, visit blackmagicdesign.com.
Welcome back, everybody. I bet you I've got a million questions. We'll see how many we'll get to. I'll try to hit the ones I think are interesting. From the meteorological side, one of the things I started to notice going through the timelines was it seemed to me Agnes trek into the more northern latitudes was considerably slower than what you typically see in an East Coast storm, which obviously with the large size would contribute to the excessive rain you got. Is that what you were seeing, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Rob Shedd from Mid-Atlantic River Forecast Center, who I work really closely, he says, one of his mentors early in the Mid-Atlantic flooding forecasting days, he learned, in at dawn, out by sunset. Like that is pretty typical for our latitudes. We do know that these systems tend to pick up pace. I mean, Isaias had wanted to get out of our, 2 years ago, Usaa was even way above average, even faster than they thought it was going to be. So typically the Mid-Atlantic, these systems do come through, yet still sometimes leave a pretty big legacy in their wake, even if they come in through a fast clip. But yes, like that was one thing that was particularly unusual about Agnes, and I think it had a lot to do with what as you mentioned, the interaction with that front, the merging, how big it was. Yeah.
I found it interesting that it took several days to complete the merger of the frontal system with the low. I'm used to seeing it happen fairly quickly when they get up in that part of the westerlies. I wonder if has there been much research done on Agnes from that standpoint, or?
Yes, and actually, I'm embarrassed because and maybe during our next break, I'll grab the name real quick, because there's one researcher in particular from New York who's written several papers on Agnes starting in the late 70s up through the 90s, and I was reading a lot of his stuff, and it was great. And in fact, some of those why was Agnes so bad was a couple of those items were pulled from his work. But I think I don't want to mess up the name, so I'll get it after the break.
Yeah. Well, I know Lance Bossart uses some Agnes.
That's who it is.
Oh, good.
I was going to say Bossart. Yeah, I was going to say Bossart. Yeah. I was like, I want to make sure I double check it. Yeah.
Yeah. He used a lot. One of his major examples in the pre-studies he's done was Agnes on that. Yeah. My guess is there wasn't much in the way of formal quantitative precipitation forecasting back then.
Actually, there was. If I and a shout out to Charles Ross from WFO State College. Actually, has gone back. So if you look at the 1970s report from USGS and NOAA, you can get the 24-hour QPFs, but they're just really hard to look at. They're black and white. Charles went back and recreated them as and colorized them, and he did in 24 hours. And actually, if you go to our multi-agency website, which we can link to, if you go through kind of like the weather page, it's like ArcGIS, you can go through there. You can actually wheel yourself through the day by day and see it progress in 24-hour periods. But we have put that work. Charles put the elbow grease into making that a little bit more digestible for a modern audience. Wow.
Were those forecasts coming out of the RFC, or were they coming out of the NSEP?
And I should clarify, I think this was coming, so what we have are the observations. So
yeah, that's why I was worried. I knew the observations they're probably better on the East Coast than anywhere back then, but still, when you look at the networks today to now, that brings me to a shift in gears there. The proliferation of flood warning systems, was Agnes perhaps a spur that happened at the right time when automation was starting to kick in to get flood warning systems and automated rain and river gauging?
Well, I can't say for certain it is, but I will say this. If my guess is that it shouldn't have been because of Agnes, because of the history of the Mid-Atlantic, like the Mid-Atlantic, because of these systems, like, not just tropical systems, it can be non-tropical, but we basically are in this bullseye area, especially because of the mountains and a lot of the factors I told you about before. We have a very long history of severe inland flooding. And so if it was because of Agnes, I would probably have told them, like, you probably should have done this, there should have been some of these, I don't know, these other 150 events. Before they started mitigating the Allegheny River, every year or every other year, it'd be the Great Allegheny or the Great Pittsburgh Flood of 19, and then add 2 years. And it would just be like something like that. It was crazy how many, Susquehanna flooded a ton back then as well. So yeah. I hope it wasn't just because of Agnes.
Yeah, I suspect the technology wasn't quite there yet, because when I was in San Antonio as a forecaster in 1978, we used to have to make phone calls to get rainfall from cooperative observers, and a handful of telemetry, you had to call into those and count the beeps to get the reading on the gauges. So we didn't have the satellite links yet. We didn't have robust radio or things like that the systems use now.
One thing to note, though, is that so back then there was the River Forecast Center in Harrisburg, and they lost comms right in the middle of Agnes. So they lost electricity and and communications right when they're needed most. But yet they found out ways to get that message out. I know talking to some of the Luzerne County emergency, the Wilkes-Barre emergency management folks who are still around today, they were paying very close attention to what was happening upstream in Towanda, Pennsylvania, along the Susquehanna. They relied heavily, and when they started getting the reports in from Towanda, that's when they were like, I don't know if we're going to win this. As far as their last ditch effort to raise the height of the levees and whatnot, but they were heavily relying on upstream, direct communication from the folks upstream as to like, okay, what's going to happen downstream. So there was some, somewhat primitive nature, but I will say again, given the technological limitations of that period, again, to see 121 fatalities overall in what was an extremely catastrophic event, I think, again, while tragic, still, it's kind of amazing to go back and look and like this. You would expect, given this period, that it would have been far worse. So, it's just interesting to see how some things failed, but yet some things still succeeded.
Were the forecasts that were put out, were they highlighting the threat of inland flooding from a tropical storm in advance of when the big rains occurred?
Yes and no. There were still limitations back then, and we still have limitations today. Right? Like, we don't know exactly where the flooding is going to be until we know where the rainfall is going to be, although we have a better idea or a better way of doing it today. Generally speaking, the forecasts were pretty good. And now there may have been maybe slightly, the lead time may not have been as great, but I know that they were tracking this. If you look at the Hurricane Center reports, around landfall, they were noting that the potential for something to move up into the mid-Atlantic. And again, it's, I don't want to speak too far in my lane, but the Weather Service got a lot of applause, especially in Pennsylvania, which was the hardest hit. Pennsylvania was very pleased with the Weather Service's performance. Some other states, perhaps to the north, weren't as pleased with Weather Service as Pennsylvania was, and they were very vocal about it. But again, there's stuff like that, there's politics and whatnot. So it was a very political event, to be sure. But overall, at least in our part of the Mid-Atlantic, Weather Service came out looking pretty good.
Yep, sounds typical. It goes on today. Tim or Hal, I'm hogging the show here. You want to chime in with some questions?
Let me ask an online question, and then Dr. Hal, I want to hear some of your questions as well, because I know you've got a lot of them being from that area. But we did get a question online from James. Just wants to know what some of the lessons are that FEMA learned as a result of Agnes for both preparation and response. Going back 50 years, that was had to have been a benchmark storm.
No, yeah. And now I will note real quick up front that FEMA was not in existence there. We could maybe talk about that toward the end. Now, Agnes was a major reason why FEMA eventually came to existence. There's a direct tie between Agnes and FEMA's creation 7 years later. If you want, I can share my screen real quick, because there are a couple of quick lessons learned I would throw out. There are several lessons learned from Agnes for today's emergency managers, but perhaps I'll just focus on a couple of what I think are the biggest ones. One of the things I think people have to remember is transportation infrastructure, surface transportation infrastructure. In events like this, it was severe and it was widespread. And roads and bridges are those things that we kind of take for granted until we don't have them. And when you are in emergency management and logistics is going to win or lose the battle, we rely heavily on things like roads and bridges, especially when they come across very large rivers like the Susquehanna or the Allegheny or the Potomac or the James or the Roanoke. So we rely very heavily on roads and bridges. And when you have an event like this, and there's just complete chaos because a lot of these primary roads, secondary roads, tertiary roads were washed out, either landslides with or temporarily flooded or you name it, or just completely washed out themselves, like destroyed. So here's some examples from Pennsylvania. Let's look at some bridges. Widespread destruction of major and even smaller bridges, which again are those things where it's just a small bridge until you realize then I have to go like 30 miles on my way to get where I need to go. oh, by the way, I might not be able to get that 30 miles because I don't know, the other roads are washed out. So you had scenes like this is down in Chesterfield County. I think that's 64 West, but don't quote me on that. You have Route 1, the Kings Highway going up closer to DC. This is I've seen several photos from Pennsylvania of bridges, these smaller bridges like this looking just like that. And up in Wilkes-Barre, we had the North Street Bridge. In fact, one of the folks we interviewed for one of our social media videos, she was crossing this bridge, I think the day before, maybe even the morning of, and it was swaying. And as she crossed it, and then the other person we interviewed watched this bridge disintegrate during a quick break he took from the command center, and he just watched it disintegrate. He couldn't even hear it disintegrate because the flooding was so loud. But we also had widespread impacts to rail transportation. This is near Danville, Pennsylvania. A bridge gave out under the train and caused a major derailment. And this thankfully wasn't a derailment because the engineer, this is a big, important rail bridge that's south of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, across the Susquehanna, slowed down because he noticed this dip in the bridge. And thankfully he did not try to cross the bridge. A week later, the bridge finally gave out. Long after the crusting, he gave out, and that's a very important bridge for commerce. So why is that important? The other thing I really would stress is air operations. Air operations were key. This was during the Vietnam War, and people were saying how much the Mid-Atlantic will like Vietnam during this period, and it was both for getting supplies around. You had again entire counties and towns are completely cut off. So that's how you got the supplies around. Here's some pictures from Wilkes-Barre itself that are pretty dramatic. Search and rescue is one of the most primary importances of the air operations. You see some folks there who are rescuing. This is why we do what we do. And you had to get creative with evacuation centers and shelters. This is Pocono Downs, which is today Mohegan Sun up in Wilkes-Barre. This is a racetrack. They had to get creative in the airport and colleges, and the hospitals had to be evacuated as well. And they even had to make makeshift hospitals. This is one last piece, I'll hand it back to you. One of the interesting things I heard from another gentleman named John Comey, who was the state public information officer. 3 weeks before he got the job, he was working for the Chamber of Commerce for like Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. And I saw this picture before I talked to him, and there's no context to why there's a hearse in this photo. It just says patients being evacuated. And I was like, and no one's talking about the hearse. And then I had this conversation with him without even bringing up this photo. He mentioned that, they needed to evacuate all these hospitals. So they had to get very creative. And he had these business contacts from his chamber job, and he was able to get the funeral directors to give additional, basically they needed ambulances, so they used hearses. Similarly, actually real quick, I'll go down to here. We were using boxcars to get down near Harrisburg. We were getting patients closer to the hospital because of washouts via boxcar and railroad. So those are the big things I would pull out. I mean, there are tons of examples. I could go on for 3 hours, but I'm sure you don't want me to do that. But I'll leave it at that.
I'll jump in. I know you've got some questions to ask.
Sure.
I'll lead them.
Yeah, Mike, fantastic presentation, really engaging. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple questions. Number one, how well do people really know this history in their communities? Do we see a lot of high water marks on buildings? Do we see, if you walked in downtown Wilkes-Barre, would anyone be able to kind of tell that this really bad flood happened in the early 70s, or is that not so evident on the landscape?
It depends on where. I can't tell you off the top of my head how many high watermarks there are in certain towns. I have seen a couple in the Wilkes-Barre or some in the Harrisburg area. I know the flood wall they have in Richmond does mark where Agnes was, and it's officially on record as the number one flood for Richmond, although the 1770 flood they believe was higher, although we didn't have a gauge back then in 1770. So they still mark it on the wall higher than Agnes. But anyhow, the point, I think it really is memorialized or commemorated via what we call oral history. I grew up not seeing anything like any historical markers about Agnes or anything physical to show me about Agnes. I grew up hearing about Agnes constantly growing up like that. I don't want to compare it to 9/11. It wasn't as monumental of an event as 9/11, but for folks in the areas that got hit, especially Pennsylvania, it is a 9/11 like event in the sense that some people talked about things like pre-flood and after the flood. And that is the thing that we, and that says a lot for Pennsylvania, again, like, which gets floods all the time. So that is that's how I learned about it. That's how you have to learn about it, which probably one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing is to try to keep the memory alive for perpetuity's sake, because, eventually those oral histories from the people who lived it are going to have to be remembered a different way than from them directly. So we have to keep the memory alive for these type of efforts. And the Silver Jackets, which is a multi-agency group, the Army Corps and FEMA and Weather Service and a number of the state agencies, and some of these other nonprofit or river basin commissions and such. This is why we're doing a project like this, to keep that memory alive.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And a second question I have, as I work especially along the Gulf Coast, I mean, nationwide, we have this concept of a base flood elevation, which communities embrace and accept to be an estimate of the 100-year flood. A lot of times along the Gulf Coast, I consistently see, I'm thinking like Pensacola, Florida, for example. We have 3 high water marks higher than 9 feet, but the base flood elevation comes in at 7 feet. And so sometimes it seems like maybe the base flood elevation or the 100-year flood level is underestimated or doesn't really match the local history. As you've compiled a lot of these histories for the mid-Atlantic states, when you compare the high water marks from these different floods against perhaps base flood elevation, does it match up pretty well? Or in some cases, do you feel like, some communities have had 4 or 5 events well above the 100-year flood?
Well, I'll answer that this way. It's when you look at strictly at the historical record, it can kind of be deceiving. And one of the reasons is if you have good mitigation, and I think Wilkes-Barre is an example of this. So we had Tropical Storm Lee come through in 2011, crested higher than Agnes did, and yet the impact to the area, because they built up the levees higher after Agnes, because of that, the impact to the area was still severe, but not as bad as it was during Agnes, even though that crest was higher. It's what about, you have some of these lower crests from, the storms, pre-Agnes. 1865, there was a big, in March 1865, there was a big, spring thaw flood. You have the flood of floods, in my opinion, as far as, wide scale. The one that actually does beat Agnes is 1936. And 1936 flood really hit Wilkes-Barre hard, but it didn't crest as high. But if you didn't have the same mitigation back then, even if it was a lower crest, the impacts are going to be, harder, or at least, felt harder. So I think that's why when you look at history, there's a little bit of apple and oranges type stuff you got to be careful about. And there's a whole, and as far as when you get into the floodplains and how we kind of develop those type of metrics or those areas, it's very complicated and very complex. So I don't want to talk too far in my lane, but just know that that's why you have to kind of take things in historical perspective.
The flood that people talk about in Pennsylvania so often, of course, is the 1889 Johnstown flood. Was Johnstown impacted by this? That was, of course, not just a weather-related event. That was something else. But were they impacted?
Johnstown, and I can share my screen real quick again, and we can get up to the exit. So short answer to your question is no, they weren't actually. It was not. They were spared. Again, it's. However, 5 years later, they had the 1977 Johnstown flood, which is considered like the third Johnstown flood. So it was not impacted severely. But the 1889 storm was another one of those regional floods. You had the Johnstown flood. I call it the Johnstown flood storm because there was actually a huge part of the region that was impacted. We focused heavily on Johnstown because of how horrific that flood was. And fatalities wise, you basically, exponentially worse than Agnes. But yet, it was, that's why I'm like, is Agnes the worst flood in Pennsylvania history, mid-Atlantic history? Like you can make in certain ways, yes, but it's so hard when you look back at the Johnstown flood and just how tragic and sad that was. It's like, that was just, to me, that's like that, to me, that's the worst flood, to be quite honest, because of how severe and just, almost cinematically severe that event was.
Talk about Lock Haven a little bit, where you were born. My brother got married there in 1971, and he's watching today, so he'll probably tell me I'm telling the story wrong. But we all stayed, I think, the Fallon House right there on Water Street, and they got married, I think, in the Presbyterian Church. And then a year later, all that was underwater, and the Fallon House never got back to where it was before. But he talks about his mother-in-law hanging out the window of their apartment fishing because they lived there downtown. I mean, Lock Haven had another one of those significant impacts.
Yeah, and actually, I won't do full screen on this. I'll just show you here. This is Lock Haven right here, and it is still the #1 flood of record. But that's a view from Lock Haven. We also have this view from Lock Haven as well. This is right downtown. The Woolworths, which my mom still talks about, the Woolworths. Here's the town square. I guess I don't know if this is a good opportunity to kind of give the little twist or the thing we mentioned, teased earlier in the call. But we can here. Let me unshare my screen. I'll pull it up. But I do have one very weird connection to everything like this. And you know what? I've been studying this storm for since college, and really in earnest since in the last 2 years. And I didn't discover this until about late March of this year. So we're getting ready, and one night I'm just sitting there, and I'm looking at this. And when I discovered this picture, that's the night I discovered this picture, and I dug a little deeper. So you remember this church I was baptized in? Does anybody want to take a guess what the name of this church is?
The Holy Waters Church of.
So I was baptized in St. Agnes Catholic Church. I was both, I was literally, figuratively baptized in the waters of Agnes. Because I imagine that with the flooding this height, like it had to get some of that flood water, some of those molecules had to get into the to the baptismal chamber, and 12 years later it had to be some sort of microscopic a remnant of Agnes. But no, I didn't know this, and it was like 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night or something like that. I was just like, wait, what is going on? and you saw all those other connections I had, my dorm room from freshman year of college, like all this stuff. And when I discovered that, I was like, okay. I told my wife, and she told me to get out of town. So, yeah. Anyhow, since we brought up Lock Haven, it was pretty hard hit. There's tons of photos from there, and
they've got a big flood wall there, don't they?
I mean, a lot of the communities there did raise their levees after Agnes. The other thing I'll note real quick, if you want to talk about mitigation, I think is a very important story. Agnes could have been far, far worse if it weren't for the mitigation. And so Agnes was really bad. Now, hear what I'm saying. Agnes was really bad, and it would have been a lot worse if it weren't for the mitigation that happened after the 1936 flood and the floods in between there. Sunbury, Pennsylvania, which is not far from Lock Haven, their flood wall held up. Like every else's mitigation project were failing. Sunbury, some held up. In fact, they spray painted on their wall, and this was on their wall for a very long time. We love you all. So mitigation did. Now I told you there's going to be a cameo real quick. I told you about my hometown of Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, which is it's literally a Hallmark town. Hallmark based one of the movies in Christmas movies in Wellsboro, to give you an idea of the type of town I grew up in.
Go ahead and share your screen so we can see what you're going to show.
What's that?
Go ahead and share your screen so we can see what you're going to show us.
Oh, okay. I thought you could see it. Oh, sorry about that. Let me see here. Okay, so here's we love you all. This is Sunbury. They spray painted they're on there. But anyhow, Wellsboro is where I grew up. Now, we were saved by the reservoirs, and the reservoirs were run by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. Now, for those who work in the Weather Service, is there a certain name that's popping out? Don Lindsay, who is the father of Scott Lindsay. Scott Lindsay is from my hometown in northern Pennsylvania. He lives living there during Agnes. In fact, the curfew went into effect, but his dad was in the Soil Conservation Service, so he was driving around the county, the areas he weren't supposed to be driving around afterwards. And Scott's stories are very interesting. So I wanted to, for the Weather Service folks, I thought that was pretty interesting. And we didn't talk about Pittsburgh today because of the Kinzua Dam. The Kinzua Dam, which is a major and controversial at the time mitigation project, but it and then there's other stories. Buffalo was saved by its dam. A number of other towns that were still hard hit, but some of the dams at least made it less bad. So anyhow, I want to make sure mitigation gets a shout out. It's not just building dams; it's the other stuff that you don't have to build, like managing floodplains and other types of ecological ways you can do mitigation, so on and so forth. So this mitigation, pay attention. Get flood insurance. If you don't have flood insurance, you're in a floodplain. So that's one of my main take. If anybody's out there doesn't have flood insurance, look into it and get it now. So anyhow.
Bill, jump in with the last question before you throw to the last break. We've got one more break to go. Bill?
Yep. Actually, I think we've covered all I had. So I just had one more comment for you on that church. They missed their calling. They could have had on their marquee to recruit more members is come hell or high water, you're welcome at St. Agnes.
You'd think they would probably play on the name a lot more, but I have a feeling the people of Lockheed, Pennsylvania just probably didn't want to talk about Agnes that much after the fact.
Yeah,
I mean, we're kind of joking, right? Like I kind of have a light tone. I want to say the governor of Pennsylvania at the time had this quip about Agnes was agony. And the more research I did, the more you look at the numbers, the more I've seen thousands upon thousands of photos from Agnes. And it truly was an agonizing and horrible event. And I want to make sure that doesn't get lost. And, we're kind of, 50 years later, some of the edge wears off, but really for some of these people, it still hasn't worn off. And we have to always keep that in mind when memorializing or commemorating these type of events. And Agnes definitely deserves that type of treatment.
That's why we retire names of storms that do that stuff. Well, we'll be back in a moment. We got one more sponsor hit, and then we'll close her up for today.
We made USAA Insurance for members like Kate, a former Army medic made of the flexibility to handle whatever Monday has in store and tackle 4 things at once. So when her car got hit, she didn't worry. She simply filed a claim on her USAA app and said,
I've got this.
USAA Insurance is made the way Kate needs it. Easy. She can even pick her payment plan, so it's easy on her budget and her life. USAA. What you're made of, we're made for. USAA.
Beach lovers know it. Fishermen and water lovers know it. Little kids and big kids know it. Sandcastle builders, free spirits, and adventure seekers know it. Everyone who's ever been here knows it. South Padre Island is so fun, so perfect, and most of all, so Padre. Plan your escape at sopadre.com.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion we had on Agnes today. Brought back a few memories of mine, but I learned a whole lot new that I wasn't aware of from that storm. So really appreciate you doing that, Mike. Kind of look forward to having you back again for the 100th anniversary of Agnes. What do we got coming up next, Tim?
Well, again, thanks, guys. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Mike. Great program. Really enjoyed it. I'm just glad I'm not in that picture behind you, Mike. That looks like not a good place to be. So we appreciate it a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Next is tomorrow, a special program tomorrow, and that is Dr. Phil Plattsbach will join us from Colorado State University. We've got a special program to talk about his latest hurricane forecast and the changes that have come since the forecast was initially issued back in April and again early June, and just to update what's going on out there right now. So Dr. Plattsbach will join us tomorrow, a special program. So mark that on your calendar, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Again, gentlemen, thank you. Really appreciate it. Great insight and fascinating history. And we can go on for a long time. I know that. So, and the 50th bill, we'll probably look the same, maybe a little grayer hair, but we'll be here ready to do it. Thank our sponsors once again. You've seen some of their spots running throughout the program. USAA, we really appreciate them. They've been a proud sponsor for a long time, and we appreciate that. And the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, they are the host of the National Tropical Weather Conference, where they're live almost every year, minus a couple of pandemics, one pandemic, a couple of misses because of it. But South Padre Island will be back there again in April 2023. The Weather Company, the Port of Brownsville, Visit Brownsville, Black Magic Design, Walmart, all sponsors of the program. That wraps it up for today. Great program. Thanks for your questions. Thanks to everybody who joined us online and asked questions. We appreciate it. Some great information, by the way, in that online chat. A couple of links in there you might want to follow as well. In the meantime, take care. We'll see you back tomorrow morning with Dr. Phil Plattsbach.